An old man clutched the last memory of his late wife, a classic car, his hands shaking as he handed over the keys. The greedy dealer smirked, thinking he had just pulled off the perfect scam. But what he didn't know? Shaq was watching. And when Shaq steps in, let's just say the dealer's worst nightmare was about to begin. Stay till the end. This story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the row of faded cars at Rick's used auto lot, the kind of place where desperation met deception. Shaq wasn't planning on buying anything. He was just passing through, hoping to find a rare classic for his collection. But before he could even step inside, his attention snapped toward an old man standing by the dealership counter, gripping a set of car keys like they were his last lifeline. His frail hands trembled as he ran his fingers along the worn leather keychain. His suit, clean but faded, hung loosely on his thin frame. Deep lines creased his face, and his gray eyes, heavy with grief, darted between the sleazy-looking car dealer in front of him and the pristine 1971 Pontiac GTO parked outside. "I just need a fair price, son," the old man, Mr. Harris, said softly. "This car's been with me for 30 years. My wife and I bought it together." His voice wavered, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. Rick, the dealer, leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers. He barely hid his smirk as he flicked a glance at the papers on his desk. "Listen, old man," he sighed dramatically. "No one's buying these gas guzzlers anymore. Best I can do is $4,000. Shaq's brows shot up. $4,000? For a car that pristine? He wasn't an expert on classic cars, but even he knew that GTO was worth at least 10 times that amount. Mr. Harris tightened his grip on the keys, his knuckles white. 4,000? But this car, it's everything I have left. Rick shrugged, feigning sympathy. Then I guess you'll have to walk away empty-handed. Shaq noticed something then. A small medical bill peeking from Mr. Harris's coat pocket. That's why he was selling. He didn't want to part with the car. He had to. Rick slid the paperwork forward with a grin. But hey, at least you'll have some cash, right? You old folks shouldn't be driving anyway. A chuckle slipped from Rick's lips, and Shaq felt his stomach turn. Mr. Harris hesitated, his gaze darting to the car one last time. He exhaled a long, painful breath before shakily signing his name. Shaq watched as the old man slipped off his wedding ring, kissed it, and tucked it into his pocket, as if that was the only piece of his wife he had left now. The papers were signed. The deal was done. Rick clapped his hands together, grinning. "All right, she's mine now. Pleasure doing business." As Mr. Harris turned to leave, shoulders slumped, Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He couldn't just stand there and watch. Not this time. Rick leaned back in his chair. A smug grin stretched across his face as he slid the signed paperwork across the desk. "Well, well, well. That's how you do business," he muttered, tapping his pen against the document with satisfaction. Shaq stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the entire transaction unfold. His jaw tightened as he studied the pure defeat written all over Mr. Harris's face. The old man hesitated, his fingers trembling as he set the pen down. Rick, oblivious to the weight of the moment, leaned forward and smirked. "You should be thanking me, old man. This is probably for the best. Guys your age shouldn't be behind the wheel anyway. Slow reflexes, bad eyesight. We're doing the streets a favor." Shaq's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something, to step in, but he held himself back. Not yet. He needed to see just how deep Rick's arrogance ran. Mr. Harris's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he simply nodded, swallowing hard before slowly pushing himself up from the chair. With a hollow expression, he turned toward the exit. Every step looked heavier than the last. Shaq noticed the way his fingers ghosted over his empty pocket, where his keys had been only minutes ago. The moment he stepped outside, the evening breeze caught the edge of his suit jacket, making him look smaller, fragile in a way that made Shaq's chest tighten. Rick chuckled to himself as he stuffed the signed papers into a filing cabinet. Man, that was too easy. Should have gone even lower. Bet he still would have taken it. Shaq's stomach twisted. Rick didn't just take the man's car. He took his dignity with it. Mr. Harris was barely through the lot when Shaq finally made his decision. Shaq stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Hey, Rick, we need to talk." Rick tossed a wad of cash onto the counter, whistling to himself. As he leaned back in his chair, completely satisfied with his latest scam, He had just scored a rare vintage car for a fraction of its worth, and the poor old man who sold it had walked away without a fight. Too easy. That's when a shadow loomed over him. Rick's smirk faltered as he looked up, way up, into the face of a towering figure. Shaq stood there, arms crossed, his deep-set eyes locked onto Rick like a predator sizing up its prey. Rick quickly shook off his unease and forced a grin. "What can I do for you, big guy? Looking for a ride?" Shaq didn't blink. "Yeah, actually." His voice was calm but undeniably firm. "The car you just bought." The classic Rick's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to gauge Shaq's angle. "That old junker?" he scoffed, stretching out lazily in his chair. "Yeah, I guess it's mine now. You interested in classic cars?" Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. "How much?" Rick hesitated for a split second. Something about the way Shaq said it made him uneasy. But then, an idea sparked in his mind. Jackpot. If this guy wanted the car, then maybe he didn't know its real worth. Rick's smirk slowly returned. He licked his lips, leaning forward like a vulture eyeing fresh meat. "You're in luck, man. That ride is a real beauty. One of a kind." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." "Oh yeah," Rick said smoothly, his confidence growing. "Normally I'd hold on to it, sentimental value and all. But for you?" He rubbed his chin, pretending to think. "I'd let it go for 30 grand. Shaq tilted his head slightly, amused. 30? Rick nodded, his grin widening. Steal of a deal, honestly. He had just paid Mr. Harris 10 grand for that car. This was a pure profit scam. Shaq finally moved. He leaned in slightly, just enough for Rick to feel the full weight of his presence. The room seemed to shrink around them. "All right," Shaq said simply. "I'll take it." Rick's grin stretched ear to ear. He thought he had just finessed the biggest payday of his life. What he didn't know, he had just played himself. Rick leaned back, arms crossed, watching Shaq pull out a thick wad of cash. The sheer ease with which he counted the bills made Rick's smirk grow wider. This guy didn't even try to negotiate. "Smart choice, big guy," Rick said, barely containing his glee as he snatched the money from Shaq's hand. "Not a lot of folks appreciate a classic like that." Shaq just nodded, his face unreadable. Rick started punching numbers into the register, already fantasizing about how he'd spend his newfound profit. Maybe an upgrade to his car or a night out at the casino. He was winning today. But then something felt off. Shaq was too calm, too steady. No excitement, no frustration, just that same composed stare. Rick shook off the unease. "All right, let me just print this receipt for you." He slid the paper across the counter with a grin so smug it could have been trademarked. Shaq picked up the receipt, inspected it, then slid it back. "And just to confirm, this car is mine now, right?" Rick let out a short laugh. "Yeah, buddy. You overpaid for that piece of junk. It's all yours." Shaq's lips curled into the faintest of smirks. He nodded, then turned away from Rick, straight toward Mr. Harris. "Mr. Harris," Shaq's deep voice cut through the dealership's murmurs. "You still need a car, right?" Rick's face froze. The entire room went silent. Employees looked up. Customers paused mid-conversation. The weight of what Shaq had just done started sinking in. Mr. Harris, who had been standing off to the side, hunched in quiet defeat, blinked in confusion. What? The old man stammered. Shaq smiled warmly, holding out the keys. "It's yours. Take it home." Rick choked on air. His entire body went rigid. "Well, wait!" Rick burst out, hands waving wildly. "That's not how this works." Shaq turned back, his towering presence making Rick's protests feel tiny. "Why not? You can't just buy a car and give it away," Rick stammered. That's not..." Shaq tilted his head, amused. "Why not? It's mine now, isn't it?" Rick went pale. He had just realized what Shaq had done, and there was nothing he could do about it. Rick's smug expression vanished the moment Shaq turned to Mr. Harris and held out the car keys. The old man's hands trembled as he stared at them, disbelief written all over his face. Mr. O'Neill, what are you doing?" Mr. Harris stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Shaq smiled warmly. "Giving this back to the man it belongs to." A hush fell over the dealership. Employees stopped what they were doing. A couple of customers, who had been casually browsing, turned to watch the scene unfold. Even the dealership owner, Mr. Graham, had stepped out of his office, arms crossed as he observed the situation with curiosity. Rick, on the other hand, looked like he just swallowed a lemon. His face turned red as he slapped a hand down on the desk. Hold on, hold on. You can't just do that. He forced out a nervous laugh, looking around as if waiting for someone to back him up. No one did. Shaq, still holding the keys out to Mr. Harris, raised an eyebrow. Why not? Rick scoffed. Because that's not how this works. You paid for the car. It's yours. You can't just give it away for free, Shaq smirked. Why not? You were just bragging about what a great deal you made, right? The color drained from Rick's face. That's not the point, he snapped. Oh, it's exactly the point, Shaq replied smoothly. You took advantage of Mr. Harris, lowballed him, and laughed about it. Now I'm just making things right. Rick clenched his fists. That's not fair. I already signed the paperwork. It's legally mine. Shaq nodded. And now it's legally mine. And guess what? I'm giving it back to him. A wave of murmurs rippled through the dealership. Mr. Harris's lip quivered as he slowly reached out, fingers brushing the keys. His eyes welled up with tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Shaq said. Just drive safe. For a moment, Mr. Harris just stood there, overwhelmed, staring at the keys in his palm. Then with a sudden sob, he pulled Shaq into a hug. Bless you, son. Bless you. The moment should have been heartwarming. It should have been the kind of thing that ended with applause and smiles. But Rick wasn't done yet. Oh, come on, he exploded, slamming his hands on the desk. You think you're some kind of hero? That's not how business works, man. Shaq turned, crossing his arms. Oh, yeah. And what kind of business is this exactly? Rick's jaw clenched. His face was red with frustration, but he forced a laugh. You really think you can just walk in here, throw some money around, and play Robin Hood? This is a dealership, not a charity. Shaq's smile didn't waver. You sure about that? Rick frowned. What do you mean? Shaq turned to Mr. Graham, the dealership owner, who was still watching with interest. Mr. Graham, how do you feel about running a business with actual integrity? Graham rubbed his chin, then chuckled. Can't say I'm opposed to it. Rick's face twisted in panic. Wait, what are you saying? Shaq's smirk widened. I'm saying I think it's time for some changes around here. Rick's fist tightened. He wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Rick's face was a twisted mix of frustration and desperation, his confidence unraveling like a cheap suit. His hands trembled as he pointed a finger at Shaq. You think you can just waltz in here and ruin my business? Rick spat, his voice laced with panic. That car was mine. You can't just give it away. Shaq, calm as ever, simply crossed his arms. I bought it fair and square. Just like you did, right? Rick's nostrils flared. He was losing control and he knew it. That's different. You scammed me. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. I paid the price you set. That's not a scam, Rick. That's business. Rick's face turned an ugly shade of red. His mind raced, grasping for any excuse to turn the situation in his favor. Verbal agreements don't count, he blurted out, a smug grin forming on his lips as if he had just found a loophole. Legally, I can demand more money for that car. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had messed up. Shaq tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Oh? So you're saying this dealership doesn't honor sales? The entire room went silent. Employees exchanged uneasy glances. A few customers who had been watching suddenly pulled out their phones. Even Mr. Graham, the dealership owner, arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Rick swallowed hard, the weight of his own stupidity pressing down on him. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered. What I meant was… Shaq pulled out his phone, holding it up. Say that again? His voice was smooth but firm, a challenge in his tone. Just so everyone can hear. Rick's blood ran cold. The tiny red recording light on Shaq's phone screen seemed to burn into him like a spotlight, exposing his greed and arrogance for the world to see. No need for that. Rick chuckled nervously, raising his hands as if trying to wave away the situation. Sweat beaded at his forehead. Look, man, I was just talking, all right? No need to make a big deal out of it. Shaq didn't blink. Oh, but you made it a big deal, Rick. See, I thought you were just an unethical businessman. But now, he smirked. Now, you're a fraud. Rick's throat bobbed as he swallowed again. His mind screamed at him to fix this, to regain control. But it was already too late. The crowd was watching, phones were recording, and Rick had just played himself in the worst way possible. Rick's face twisted in confusion, his mind scrambling to process what he just heard. Shaq leaned casually against the counter, his massive frame radiating an effortless dominance. "You heard me," he repeated, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence. "How much for the whole dealership?" Rick's throat went dry. He let out a said laugh, but it came out more like a choked wheeze. Wait, you can't just buy the place?" The dealership owner, Mr. Graham, had just walked in, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. He stopped in his tracks, raising an eyebrow at the scene before him. He glanced at Shaq, then at Rick, who looked like he had just swallowed a lemon whole. "Morning," Mr. Graham said, his tone bored. He looked at Rick with thinly veiled annoyance. "What's the commotion this time?" Before Rick could stammer out an excuse, Shaq turned to Mr. Graham, completely ignoring the frantic salesman. "I'm thinking about buying this place," Shaq said smoothly. "What's your price?" The air shifted. A hush fell over the dealership as employees, customers, and even a few mechanics from the back peeked around the corner, listening. Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His entire world had flipped upside down in an instant. Mr. Graham smirked and took a slow sip of his coffee. He had owned this place for years, and to be honest, he was getting tired of dealing with Rick's antics. The guy was a walking headache. "That depends," Mr. Graham mused, eyeing Shaq with curiosity. "You looking to buy?" Shaq's grin widened. "Cash." Rick choked on his own breath. The dealership erupted in whispers. Rick's palms grew clammy as he looked back and forth between Shaq and Mr. Graham. This couldn't be happening. Wait, Rick stammered, holding up his hands. "You can't seriously be considering this. He's just messing with you." Mr. Graham didn't even glance at Rick. His eyes were locked on Shaq, sizing him up. "You serious?" Shaq nodded. "Dead serious." Mr. Graham let out a low chuckle. Well, guess this morning just got a whole lot more interesting." He took another slow sip of coffee, then nodded. "All right, let's talk numbers." Rick's face drained of all color. His entire body stiffened as the horrifying realization sank in. If Shaq bought the dealership, Rick wasn't just losing a sale. He was about to lose everything. Rick stood frozen, his face pale as Shaq casually pulled out a checkbook and began writing. The pen glided smoothly across the paper, the sound of ink meeting parchment almost deafening in the silent dealership. "No way," Rick muttered under his breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Mr. Graham, hoping, praying, that the owner would laugh this off as a joke. But Mr. Graham wasn't laughing. Instead, he leaned forward, watching Shaq's hand with interest. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a glint in his eye, like a businessman who had just found the perfect way out of a long, tiresome problem. Shaq finished writing, then tore the check from the book with a crisp rip. He held it out to Mr. Graham with a relaxed smile. "That should cover it," Shaq said smoothly. The employees gasped. Some whispered in disbelief. A mechanic who had been watching from the back actually dropped his wrench. Mr. Graham took the check, adjusted his glasses, and examined the amount. Whatever he saw made his eyebrows lift slightly. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Pleasure doing business with you," Mr. Graham said, shaking Shaq's massive hand. The room exploded into murmurs. Rick's stomach twisted into knots. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "Wait, no way!" His voice rose in panic. "You're actually selling it to him?" Mr. Graham shot Rick an unimpressed glance. "Why wouldn't I?" Rick threw up his hands. Because he doesn't even know how to run a dealership." Shaq chuckled, crossing his arms. "I didn't need to know how to run a dealership to know you were scamming people. And guess what? Now I do run a dealership." He smirked. "Mine." Rick's breathing turned shallow. He spun to Mr. Graham. "You can't just hand it over like that. I work here." Shaq tilted his head. "Yeah, about that." He let the words hang in the air for a second before saying the three words that would change Rick's life forever. "You're fired." The room went silent. Rick's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. He turned to Mr. Graham, begging, his former boss to step in and override this madness. But Mr. Graham just shrugged. "Honestly, Rick, you had this coming for a long time." Rick's entire body went rigid. His skin burned with humiliation as employees tried and failed to hide their smirks. Rick clenched his fists, his face turning red. "You'll regret this, Shaq," he spat. But Shaq? He just laughed, because Rick had no idea how over it really was. Rick's face twisted with desperation. His entire world had just crumbled in the span of minutes, and he refused to accept it. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the counter, sweat beading on his forehead. "This is insane! You can't do this!" Rick's voice cracked, his cocky bravado completely gone. "You think you can just waltz in here, wave some cash around, and own this place?" Shaq stood tall, his arms crossed, unfazed. "Rick," he said, his voice steady, almost amused. "I do own this place." Rick's breath hitched. His eyes darted around the dealership, searching for support. But the employees, the ones he had bullied and overworked for years, weren't rushing to his defense. Instead, they stood quietly, watching, some relieved, others barely hiding their satisfaction. "Mr. Graham," Rick turned frantically to the former owner, his voice rising in pitch. "You can't be serious. I've worked here for years." Mr. Graham sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, and for years I've had complaints about you. Customers scammed, employees mistreated. I ignored it too long, but—" He gestured at Shaq. "This is a fresh start." Rick let out a bitter laugh. "You're firing me just because this guy walked in?" He gestured wildly at Shaq. Shaq smirked. "No, Rick, we're firing you because you're bad at your job." The room erupted into chuckles. Rick's nostrils flared. His pride was crumbling, but he wasn't going down quietly. "I won't leave," he declared, slamming a fist on the counter. "This is my dealership. You can't just throw me out like trash." Shaq exhaled and turned toward Mr. Graham. "We got security here?" Mr. Graham nodded and signaled toward the showroom entrance. Almost immediately, two large security guards stepped forward, their expressions blank but their stance firm. Rick paled. "Rick," Shaq said, shaking his head, "let me explain this in simple terms. You don't work here anymore. You're trespassing." Rick's mouth flapped like a fish gasping for air. I'll sue! You'll hear from my lawyer." Shaq chuckled. "Great. Tell him to call my lawyers." Rick's jaw clenched, but before he could say another word, the security guards grabbed his arms. "Wait! No! Get your hands off me!" he screeched, flailing like a fish caught in a net. The customers and employees watched, some holding up their phones, recording the entire meltdown. As Rick was dragged past the showroom, people clapped. One customer called out, "Hey, Rick, what was that you said earlier?" "That's not how this works." The crowd laughed. Rick thrashed in the guard's grip. "You'll regret this, Shaq. This isn't over." Shaq leaned against the counter, grinning. "Nah," he said, watching Rick struggle uselessly. "It's over." Rick was gone. And now? It was time for Shaq to really shake things up. Shaq stood in the center of the dealership, his towering frame making the entire room feel smaller. The employees, still in shock over what had just happened, gathered around him. Moments ago, their nightmare of a manager had been dragged out, screaming about revenge. Now they were left staring at the man who had just bought their entire business in cash. "All right," Shaq said, his deep voice calm but commanding. "Things are going to change around here." The room stayed silent. Some employees exchanged uncertain glances. Others straightened up, sensing that this wasn't just another rich guy making a flashy purchase. This was something different. A man in his mid-40s wearing a name tag that read Jerry cleared his throat. What exactly does that mean, sir?" Shaq smirked. "First rule, no more scams. No more pushing junk cars on people who don't need them. No more price gouging desperate folks who just need a way to get to work." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some employees nodded in agreement. Others looked hesitant, probably wondering if they'd still have jobs tomorrow. A young woman, Maria, who had been working the front desk, hesitated before raising her hand. "But, sir, that's how Rick ran things. If we stop, won't the dealership lose money?" Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, you're thinking short term. Rick was making money by tricking people. We're going to make money the right way. Fair deals, honest sales, a place where people trust us." Jerry, the senior employee, nodded slowly. "That actually makes sense." Another salesman, Todd, crossed his arms. "And if we don't like these changes?" Shaq's eyes locked onto him. The entire room went still. "Then you can walk out that door with Rick," Shaq said, pointing toward the entrance. "I don't run scams. I don't cheat people. So if that's the only way you know how to sell a car, you're in the wrong place." Todd gulped. He had seen what happened to Rick. He wasn't about to test Shaq. "No, sir. Just asking." Shaq nodded. Good. Then he turned to Maria. You got a family, Maria? She blinked in surprise. Uh, yes. A daughter. Shaq smiled. And if you needed a car, would you want someone like Rick selling it to you? Maria clenched her jaw, shaking her head. No. That's why we're changing things. Shaq turned to the rest of the employees. From now on, we treat people like family. We help them, not trick them. The room slowly shifted. Employees who had been nervous started nodding. They were tired of Rick's ways. Maybe this wasn't such a bad change after all. Then Shaq grinned. And one more thing. We're slashing prices today. Gasps, murmurs. Jerry's eyes widened. Wait, what? Shaq turned to Maria. How many customers in the lobby? She peeked through the glass doors. At least a dozen. Shaq clapped his hands together. Well, let's give 'em a deal they'll never forget. The news spread fast. Within the hour, the dealership was packed. Customers who had once dreaded walking into the place were now met with honesty, fair prices, and, most shocking of all, Shaquille O'Neal himself personally helping people pick out cars. Social media blew up. Photos of Shaq shaking hands with customers, signing autographs, and even taking selfies with excited families flooded the internet. A local news station showed up. Reporters squeezed in, eager to cover the shocking transformation of what had once been the most hated car dealership in town. By the end of the day, the numbers were in. Shaq's dealership had made more in honest sales in one afternoon than Rick had scammed in a month. And as Shaq stood by the showroom window, watching the last happy customer drive away, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Shaq, this is the mayor. We need to talk. Shaq smirked. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The city was taking notice, and Shaq was just getting started. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the glass windows of the newly rebranded dealership. Inside, the energy was electric. The news of Shaq's takeover had spread like wildfire, and customers were pouring in, some skeptical, some hopeful, all curious. Maria, still adjusting to the massive changes, was at the front desk when she noticed a woman hesitating by the entrance. She was clutching the hand of a little boy, her other hand gripping the strap of her worn-out purse. Her eyes darted across the showroom, scanning the cars with a mix of longing and doubt. Shaq, standing near the lot, caught sight of her and immediately noticed her hesitation. He walked over, his towering presence unmistakable, but his warm smile instantly eased her nerves. Hey there, Shaq said, his deep voice gentle. You looking for something special today? The woman, startled, looked up. I need a car, she admitted, shifting uncomfortably. But I don't have great credit, and I know how these places work. Shaq crouched down slightly to meet her son's eye level. What's your name, little man? The boy clutched his mother's leg but whispered, Daniel. Shaq grinned. Nice to meet you, Daniel. You like cars? The boy nodded eagerly, pointing to a sleek silver sedan. That one? Shaq chuckled. Good choice. Huh? You got taste. Then he turned back to the woman. All right, let's get you set up. No tricks, no scams. Just a good car at a fair price. Sound good? The woman blinked, clearly unprepared for such honesty. Wait, really? Really, Shaq confirmed. Follow me. Employees who had worked under Rick's cutthroat sales tactics for years watched in disbelief as Shaq personally helped the woman pick out a reliable, affordable vehicle. He walked her through everything. No hidden fees, no aggressive upsells. When she nervously mentioned her financial struggles, Shaq made sure she got a fair payment plan, with no ridiculous interest rates. By the time she signed the papers, she had tears in her eyes. I never thought I'd be treated this way at a dealership, she admitted. Thank you. Shaq handed her the keys, flashing a grin. Just promise me one thing. She wiped her eyes. What's that? He pointed to Daniel. Let this little guy pick the first song you play in the car. Daniel beamed. Mom, can we play my superhero soundtrack? She laughed, nodding. Absolutely. Shaq watched as they drove off, the boy's excited voice echoing through the rolled-down window. That moment, more than any business decision, was why he did this. Meanwhile, across town, Rick was fuming. Sitting in a dingy apartment, he scrolled through his phone, watching in horror as video after video showed Shaq turning his former business into something respected. The dealership was trending. Customers were lining up. Even local news had picked up the story. Former NBA star Shaquille O'Neal turns failing dealership into a model of ethical business. Rick gritted his teeth. Unbelievable, he muttered. Just then, a notification popped up. A live interview. He tapped the screen, and there was Shaq, sitting across from a well-known journalist, a smile on his face. Back at the dealership, a reporter had arrived, eager to document the transformation. So Shaq, the reporter asked, adjusting her microphone, most celebrities invest in restaurants, clothing lines, or tech companies. Why a car dealership? Shaq leaned back, thoughtful. Because people need cars. Not luxury items, not overpriced brands. Just a way to get to work, pick up their kids, live their lives. And too many people get taken advantage of in places like this. The reporter nodded. And what's the response? Ben? Shaq smirked. Let's just say business is booming. The reporter turned to one of the employees, Jerry, who had been with the dealership for years. You worked under the old management. How do things feel now? Jerry, who had once dreaded coming to work, smiled. Honestly, it feels like we're finally doing something right. The interview aired that night, and the internet exploded. Customers flooded in. People shared their experiences online, praising the fair prices, the honest sales, the fact that Shaq himself was often there, shaking hands and making sure things ran smoothly. The dealership that had once been a symbol of greed was now a beacon of fairness. And Rick? He could only watch as Shaq's legacy grew bigger than ever. The world was about to know how Shaq changed everything. Rick sat in the dim light of his tiny, cluttered apartment, the flickering glow of the television casting long shadows across the room. His jaw tightened as he watched the news segment unfolding before him. Shaquille O'Neal's bold move to transform a once controversial car dealership into a fair and honest business has taken the city by storm. The camera cut to a wide shot of the dealership, now rebranded with sleek signage and a line of happy customers walking through the doors. Employees who once dreaded their shifts now smiled as they assisted families, helping them find cars without the pressure and deception Rick had once enforced. Rick gritted his teeth. This was supposed to be his empire. The news anchor continued. Customers are raving about the fair pricing and honest deals. One woman, a single mother, shared her story, saying she was afraid of being scammed but was personally helped by Shaq himself. The screen changed to a clip of Maria, the former receptionist, now confident and beaming. It's not just a dealership anymore, she said. It's a place people can trust. Rick clenched his fists, his face turning red. And then came the final blow. The screen cut to Shaq's live interview, the big man sitting comfortably in a chair, exuding confidence and warmth. The reporter leaned forward with a smirk. Shaq, let's be real. This was a failing business when you took over. What's your secret? Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Man, it's simple. Treat people right. When you're honest, when you actually care, people notice. The reporter laughed. And what about the previous management? Rick leaned in, his pulse pounding. Shaq raised an eyebrow, then let out a deep laugh. Oh, Rick. Man, look, karma always delivers. The entire studio laughed with him. The audience clapped. And Rick? He felt like the walls were closing in. The news segment ended, transitioning to a commercial. But Rick had already grabbed the remote and hurled it across the room. It crashed against the wall, batteries popping out and rolling onto the floor. His phone buzzed. He snatched it up, half expecting a job offer, a lifeline, anything to redeem himself. But when he looked at the screen, his stomach sank. A new headline: Disgraced ex-manager Rick Carter faces backlash. Former employees speak out. He scrolled, his eyes widening in horror. Jerry, the salesman he used to push around, had given a brutal interview. Rick made working there miserable. He pressured us to scam people. If we didn't hit his insane quotas, he'd threaten to fire us. He got what was coming. Rick's heart pounded. He checked the comments. Thousands of people were celebrating his downfall. Dude got what he deserved. Shaq turned that place into something good. Rick was the problem all along. Imagine getting finessed by Shaq himself. Couldn't be me. Rick's hands trembled. Every bridge was burned, every door closed. And as he sat there alone, drowning in his own failure, one final thought echoed in his head. Shaq didn't just take his dealership. He took everything. The camera zooms out. Shaq's legacy just got even bigger.